Welcome, everyone. My name is Pato Hebert. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Department of Art and Public Policy here at Tisch School of the Arts, New York University. And this spring, the Department of Art and Public Policy is partnering with NYU Skirball to present a series of programs called Art and Its Publics. Today's event is the inaugural program in the series, and there will be others at the end of this month and in April. We'll be sure to let you know, but I'm especially excited for tonight's conversation with NYU Provost and Arts Politics Professor Grace Aneiza. We're here to celebrate her recent book, Liminal Spaces, Migration and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora. She will be joined by MA Arts Politics alumni, Jessica Duby and Kimiyo Bremer, to discuss the Guyanese narratives of migration that are featured in the book and the role of art in telling women's stories. When we think about art, what is it that we imagine? And when we say the public, who do we understand this to be? Professor Ali often notes that Guyanese people make up the 5th largest immigrant group in New York City alone. Her work reminds us of the world making and the public power of this vibrant community, particularly its visionary women artists. And before we delve deeper and get right into the program, I do want to thank a few people who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring us together tonight. Jay Wegman, the director of NYU Skirball, and his fantabulous team. Ellen Toscano, who's a fearless leader who wears many hats at NYU. Vice Provost Charlton McElwain, who among many other duties shepherds the NYU's Provost Fellowship Program, and a deeply grateful nod to Kristen Kalaki and Emily Brown of the Department of Art and Public Policy. The pandemic may still require us to be on Zoom, but it cannot keep us from coming together thanks to all of these folks' efforts. And of course, we're here to listen to 3 amazing women, and it's my pleasure and great honor to introduce them. First, I'm proud to call Grace Aneiza Ali a valued colleague. She is a curator and assistant professor and provost fellow in the Department of Art and Public Policy. She also serves as the curator at large for the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City. Her recent book, Liminal Spaces, is a historic publication and a groundbreaking effort. It's such a pleasure to welcome Professor Ali and to honor her work and that of the artists whose creativity she showcases. Guiding tonight's conversation are 2 alumni of the APP program. Jessica Duby is a curator, consultant, and artist focused on ecofeminism, ritual as resistance, and institutional intervention. Her practice is informed by experiences working in cultural diplomacy at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery and at the National Museums of Asian Art. She graduated in May 2020 with a master's in arts politics from Tisch. Kimiyo Bremer is an artist, scholar, and writer from Los Angeles, whose research focuses on critical race theory, Black feminism, gender studies, media studies, popular culture, and visual culture. In 2018, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in theater and performance from Bard College. And in 2020, she graduated with a master's degree in arts politics from here at NYU. She's the co-author of Color Coded from 2018. She's the curator of the curatorial research project Gazing Onward, Contemporary Exhibitions Disrupting the White Gaze. And she's developed 2 institutional public programs for Poster House. She's also written Public Spaces, Hidden Faces, Juneteenth and Black Citizenship in America Today, as well as Broadening Realities, Reading Kamala Harris's Black and Indian Identity Through Image. Currently, she works as an assistant to Karen Finley. Professor Ali, Kimiyo, and Jessica will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll field questions from all of you who've joined us. We'll use the Q&A function, and for those of you who may be new to Zoom or a little disoriented at this hour, it's those double comic book speech balloons that are in the lower right center of your screen. As you're listening to this dynamic conversation, please feel free to start populating the Q&A with your questions, and we'll be sure to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the program to try to respond thoughtfully to your queries. Now, we're in webinar mode here in the Zoom room, but if we were together and sitting in Skirball Center, I would ask all of you to please put your hands together and help warm up the space along with the honking horns to welcome our 3 phenomenal speakers. We are so fortunate to be with you tonight. Professor Ali, welcome.
Pato, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I want to take a moment to embarrass my former students just a little bit. I was thinking about the last time I saw both of you in person, and it was, I think, exactly a year ago. And we learned together in class that we were going on lockdown. So it's not the best anniversary, 1 year anniversary. But I really wanted to say to the people that are joining us tonight that when Pato extended this invitation to do this program with our department, the two of you were the people that I absolutely wanted to be in conversation with about this book. And I'm really proud of the work that you've done since I last saw you, since you've graduated, in the midst of pandemics and so much loss and so much sorrow. You've really forged through. You've done brilliant work. You're in PhD programs starting in the fall. You're curating brilliant projects. But most importantly, you've shown incredible care and thoughtfulness to your friends and your family and your community in the past year. And so it's just so lovely to be here talking with you, and so lovely to see how you've chosen to thrive in the last year. So welcome, and thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, thank you for having us. This is such a wonderful, I mean, any opportunity to speak with you is a great opportunity, so I really appreciate being here and being in conversation with Jess too.
It's an honor.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
So first of all, we love this book so much. And a lot of things really came through for us in this text. And I think one of the very first things was how much love and care was put into this book. I mean, the book just exudes love, and we can tell how much you care for, not only the contributors that are here in the text, and I think it's like 15 Guyanese women that contributed to the book, but just for, the Guyanese community in general. And some of the other things that came up for us too were how many roles that you kind of took on in this book. You were an author, you're a curator, you're an editor, gatherer, activist, all of these different things. And the book itself performs all of these different actions. It's not just a book, it's an exhibition and it's an act of resistance too. And so one of the things that we kind of discussed and what we wanted to know about was how this book came about, and how the idea for the book came about, because it is the first of its kind, right? We don't see very many books or any books at all really that center Guyanese women and their stories. And what we also wanted to know was, what does it mean to have a book like this out in the world?
Well, it's been a long journey. It's been a 5-year journey, and there was a lot of rejection from publishers and a lot of, sure, it sounds great, but we don't think, there's a market for it. There's an audience for it. And largely that's due to the fact that a lot of people don't know about Guyana, know where Guyana is, know about its history and its culture. So we've actually been working on this book, started working and writing it, the contributors and I, about 5 years ago. And then blanking the year, I should have asked Ellen to remind me, but I think about 2 years ago, Ellen Toscano and Dr. Deborah Willis gathered about 40 amazing global scholars and artists and thinkers in Florence for us to have a conversation privately in a very safe and intimate space about what migration means to us in deeply personal ways, but also what it means for our communities, for our larger cities, for the diaspora. And so that was another catalyst to move the book from 15 women thinking about this book idea and this project and starting to write it, to get it actually published. So the same publisher that published the lovely anthology edited by Ellen Toscano and Deborah Willis and Kalia Brooks published the book. The book is called Women Migrations. Also, we're really moved by the nuanced story, particularly about Guyanese women, and took on our project. So it was perseverance, and it was also, having an incredible community of support from other women scholars that saw the value in what we were trying to do and carve out a separate story for Guyanese women that allowed the book to be in the world.
It's so beautiful, Grace. We also really wanted to touch at the very beginning about your contribution to the book. It's called The Geography of Separation. It is so incredibly gorgeous. In this work, you frame 4 vignettes as a travelogue, your arrivals and departures in the lives of a woman or girl you've encountered in Guyana, India, and Ethiopia. It struck me how each of these experiences humbled you so deeply. And as the book's originator and someone who's traveled many, many roads that, as you said in the introduction, all lead back to Guyana, I wondered if it was difficult for you to choose which of your own stories to share. How'd you decide to frame your own narratives as arrivals and departures in the lives of these women? And how did these stories interact with each other in the greater context of the book?
I wanted to start from, the book is quite interdisciplinary. So it's 15 women of Guyanese heritage. These women are from, of course, Guyana, but they're also in the diaspora. They're in New York, they're in Toronto, they're in London. So we're coming at it from these various GPS locations, but we're also coming at it from very, very interdisciplinary places. And so there's visual art, there's photography, there's memoir, there's poetry, there's essays, there's curatorial essays. And that is what I love the most about it, is that we were able to be very free in our interdisciplinary approach to these issues around migration. But what connected all of us, and I think connects anybody that's not even intimately aware of our migration hasn't impacted them, which I think is rare, because one of the things that we say in the book is migration is the 21st century defining experience of so many of our lives. But this idea of how we enter and how we exit people's lives, and how we enter and how we exit a place, I think it's a deeply fundamental, universal thing for all of us to grapple with. And so I came from that personal place in the book, and a lot of the contributors did as well. And I also wanted to reckon with my own self, and as much as I could, honestly, because I spent the first 14 years of my life in Guyana, and those are very formative years. So when I arrived in the United States with my family at 14, it wasn't like I was arriving at 2. I was at 14. Most of us are pretty shaped and formed at that age. And so I spent 14 years being on the one end of the spectrum, which is seeing people leave the country and seeing people leave me and my family. And I write a lot about my mother too, who spent 20 years watching. My mother is one of 7 siblings. She spent about 15 to 20 years watching her family members, her siblings, one by one leave the country for the UK, for Canada, for the United States, and ultimately leave her. And so I wanted to grapple with both ends of that, the arrivals, the departures, the exits, and the entrances, because I think there's something deeply, the emotional landscape of that is deeply fertile. And then after I left and, started my life in the United States and went to college and all of these things, then as an adult, my work took me to places like India and Ethiopia, which I write about in The Geography of Separation. And so then I became the one doing the leaving. And I wanted to really reckon with my role in that, the ways in which I would leave, the ways in which I would enter people's lives. I spent almost a year in India as a Fulbright scholar, and I wrote about that experience of what it means to show up in a place, connect and make a community for yourself, and then leave. And so the book pulls at those two tensions a lot. And when we talk about the migration story, what does it mean to enter people's lives? What does it mean to exit their lives?
It really pulled my heart open to read your section, and I need to reread it again and again, I think, just to stay with it and really go deeper, because it's so rich and there are so many complex layers.
Yeah, there's a lot of really beautiful and I think touching and thought-provoking things that happen in the geography of separation. I'm kind of with Jess on that. Even like I've reread it, you know, again, and it's still like, I feel like I miss things. Every time I come back, I find something new. Something that kind of also stuck out for me in that section was we keep seeing these reappearances of this notebook, right? And you talk about a notebook that you had, and you talk about you wanting to be a writer, which obviously has happened. But you know, you also talk about this notebook that you give to Indra's daughter, and Indra, the woman that you know worked in your building when you went to go and study in India. But also the notebook that you find in the hands of this girl who's in Ethiopia when you're going over there as well. And I thought that it was really beautiful because you kind of presented for us these stories and these images of women and girls who are able to document themselves for themselves. And I think that that's also something that happens in this book throughout. And instead of it just, you know, being you documenting yourself, you're also documenting the stories of others, which I think is really important. And then something else that's really great too, is that, you know, in presenting the possibilities of the notebook kind of through these stories and these images, you also show the power of declaring your presence just by taking up space on a page, which also happens in this book, which I think is something, it was so beautiful to me. And I didn't know if you had anything to say about that, but it really resonated with me.
I grew up with women in my family that were illiterate, that couldn't read and write. And to come from, you know, that's just maybe one generation removed. So to come from that to having, you know, a book in the world with other Guyanese women is an incredibly humbling arc. And so I wanted, you know, when the stories about writing and about documenting our lives, and I love the way that you just shaped that, Kimi, and explained that. It comes from that place. And so many of the women in the book come from very, very humbling beginnings, both themselves and the other women that they're writing about and featuring and talking about, come from very, very poor, humbling beginnings. And women not being able to read and write in the places that we grew up in Guyana was more our norm than our exception sometimes. So to have this book in the world written by women, about women, featuring the stories of women, when you come from that legacy of growing up around illiteracy, that in itself, I think, is a powerful statement. So I love the way that you called the book, I think you said, sort of a document of resistance. It is. It really, I really think it is.
Thank you for that, Grace. I also had another question that I wanted to ask, and it's also about your section in the geography of separation. And it's related to Indra as well. But you discuss, you know, how you went and you traveled to India to do research, and you were doing a Fulbright fellowship. And, you know, you had all of these different research facilities at your disposal. But you know, on page 76 that there with Indra was where you found your education, which I thought was so beautiful. And so I wanted to ask you, how did you feel that learning from people and communities, or how do you feel that learning from people and communities is just as much, if not more important than learning from an institution or traditional academic spaces?
So I'm glad you asked this question because you all are newly graduates of our master's program. And so you're just recovering from that. And Kimi, you're about to enter into it again at Cornell. I really struggled in grad school with the notion of sitting around the table and theorizing about people's lives. I really had a hard time with that. And I had a hard time with that, particularly because of how I grew up, very humbly, where I grew up, what I saw. And so I found it incredibly a privileged position to create theory and create scholarship about people's lives. They have to live the lives. And I'm sitting there theorizing about these lives. I really struggled with that a lot. And I think I continue to struggle with that. And I think it's important to struggle with that. Don't think that's a bad thing. So when we were thinking about this book, I wanted to make sure that we balanced the scholarship in this book. And I think it has some incredibly strong components of scholarship, especially by many of the contributors, the curatorial essays, the artists who are also scholars and teachers themselves. But I wanted to make sure that the scholarship didn't eclipse the real life stories and the real life experiences about Guyanese women and their engagement with migration, told by the 15 contributors in this book. I wanted to make sure that when you were finished, you felt that both of them held equal space. And that's because of that sensitivity that I have about the academy theorizing about people's real lived experiences and real lived lives. And I think sometimes if we don't get that right, we run the risk of having scholarship erase and eclipse those real important poignant stories. And so that's why the book is memoir, it's art essays, it's poetry, because we wanted to make sure that we balance scholarship with the personal narratives.
Thank you.
Something that I think really contributed to the personal narratives were ways that objects in the book grounded the reader both in the realities of the authors and the artists, but it grounded their connections to other places, people, realities. And I was wondering, since one of your many roles is as a curator, you also would talk to us a little bit about guardianship and responsibility when it comes to objects that Guyanese women inherit and decide to carry with them.
Oh my gosh, I think that's also the second or third thesis in the book is all the things we carried across these borders with us. And a lot of the stories to talk about as daughters, the roles we have as daughters to carry our mother's things across these borders. So we're not only carrying our own things, we're carrying our mother's things and our grandmother's things across borders. And so this idea of preserving, the objects, my story, I talk about this pot, this karahi that's been in my family since my grandmother. And it's a 50-year-old pot. And it's worth nothing, but we made sure we stuffed the suitcase with this pot. And this pot is at my mother's house right now. I have dibs on this pot. My sister's very upset about that. But this pot carries this incredible family history for my family. And we made sure that we brought this old pot with us to the United States. But, if we think of a very traditional, and this isn't my definition of a museum, but a traditional definition of a museum, it's a place that houses objects that has value to a community, to a society, to a city, to a group of people, then for a lot of immigrant families, these objects are very much, they would preserve these objects as if they were objects you find in museums. Our pots are just as valuable, our photographs are just as valuable as anything that we would find in museum spaces, because of that ethos of these are the objects that we preserve, these are the objects we take care of in order to continue telling our stories.
It really made a huge difference to be able to see such rich imagery of the objects, both in the form of contemporary art and in photographs, and in, for example, these works, filigree jewelry that were owned by Michelle Joan Wilkinson's family and now are in her safekeeping. I think that it was a completely different book to be able to see so many images of what the authors and artists in the book are grappling with.
Yeah, and I thought that was so wonderful. And we get to see so many things, from these remnants or these family heirlooms and photos to the contemporary artwork that people are making. I have a question that I'll ask about that later. But I also wanted to ask you too, just speaking about all of the different experiences that people have, and Guyanese people have, and specifically in this book, the ones that you discuss. You mentioned in your introduction that within these beautiful disruptive stories lies a single truth. There is no single story about migration, and that's on page 5. But more broadly speaking, I think, this text also highlights, and I've kind of touched on this, but how there is no single story about Guyana and Guyanese women. And throughout the book, we hear different stories of people who are enjoying the English landscape after they've migrated, people who, wanted to stay because they could never leave Guyana because it's such a wonderful place, people who wanted to leave but couldn't, people who, resented their parents' choice to leave, people who experienced racism abroad and at home, or people even just enjoying Caribana, when they go to Canada. Right. And so what I wanted to ask too was, what did you think was the importance of showing the rainbow of emotions and experiences that Guyanese people have?
When leaving or when leaving?
No, I guess just in general, just the rainbow of experiences, all of the different types of experiences that people have. Why is it important to show all of them?
And disrupt the single story stereotypes that in the introduction you speak about, the news just being completely inundated always with single story of stereotypes about Guyana.
I just put in the chat for everybody so that they know that they have access to all of these beautiful art and images. So the book is entirely, the online version, the PDF version is also entirely online. So that link will take you directly to the book to see some of the stories and the images that we're talking about. So I quoted in the book, and I know Professor Antonio is watching. She and I talk about this beautiful TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. We both found out that we launch a lot of our classes with this TED Talk, where Chimamanda Adichie, who is, just a profound Nigerian American author, talks about the ways in which we reduce a place to a single narrative and how damaging that is. And she says something along the lines of that the danger of a stereotype, danger of stereotyping a place is not that it's untrue, but that it's incomplete. And so that's the real danger there, that it's an incomplete story. And so for many of us, whether we're from Guyana or not, we're talking about a universal migration experience here. To leave a place for another place is a very complicated, multi-dimensional thing. Some of us leave because we're choosing to, some of us don't have a choice, some of us are leaving because of trauma, some of us are leaving because of economics. Some of us leave and return and leave and return. Some of us never return. It's a very, very multifaceted experience. And I think we run the danger of not creating space for all of those multiple ways we're coming and going from a place. The other thing that we try to do collectively in this book is show that even when you leave a place, you can still love it. That loving a place and leaving a place are not separate things, right? Many of us leave things and leave places still very much with love in our hearts for it. And there's also this narrative of we migrate and we leave and we are abandoning one place for another. And that's not the case. That's not always the case. And so what you see in this book are women struggling with the leaving, women struggling with wanting to return and not being able to. And in the same vein, women that are being honest about there's nothing left for me in the country that I left. My life is still here. There's no hierarchy for that. We wanted to bring all of that into the conversation. And we wanted to show that you can leave a place like Guyana and still find and believe that it has incredible worth and value and beauty, and still want to leave. And so I think that is the sort of another sort of tension that we try to tease out throughout the book.
Thank you.
So Kimiyo and I also really love looking at some of the artwork in the book. So we wanted to share with everyone this incredible work, Indentured To by Suchitra Matai. And we wanted to talk with you about art's role in the book a little bit more broadly. In this book, you dive really deep into the space between historical data, memory, and imagination. And in doing that, you counter gaping absence in the archive. And at the same time, partly thanks to the works of art in the book, we're clearly and directly pointed to the vastness of experiences that can and won't ever be fully expressed, taught, or archived. So in addition to kind of disrupting these single story stereotypes, can you talk to us a little bit about art's unique ability to communicate what you called the emotional terrain of separation from a motherland, and why art is essential not only in shifting these dominant narratives, but in honoring the bravery and remarkable resilience of the women of the Guyanese diaspora?
I think what we wanted to do was be very honest about the trauma of this place. You've read that Guyana was a former British colony. It has in its history a history of African enslavement, followed by a history of Indian indentured servitude and Chinese indentured servitude, followed by an incredibly difficult colonial period, followed by an even more difficult post-colonial period, and a country really trying to find a place for itself and find its way post-independence from the British. And that's the Guyana my mother grew up in. My mother grew up in a Guyana from the 1950s into the 1980s. That was an incredibly volatile place, incredibly poor place, incredibly just difficult and full of loss. And it was incredibly important for all of us, whether we were sharing stories about Guyana through writing or through photography or poetry or art, to address those histories, to be honest about those histories. But the importance of the art is this, that in addition to holding space and being honest about that trauma and those histories, that we were able to use art to envision a pathway beyond those histories, to envision a future for women that is thriving, that is full, that is multidimensional. And so that was a very conscious thing for me as editor and curator. What are the images that I'm going to present in this collection that balance those two things, that we're honest about the realities of this place, we're honest about its histories, particularly its histories of trauma, but that we also use the art and the storytelling and the visual to envision a future past those traumas and past those histories.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And I think this image also kind of illustrates that perfectly. I think Suchitra in this work is kind of rendering, right, this colonialism and this colonial history is useless. And so, you know, I just think it's really beautiful, just thinking about, again, yeah, moving beyond kind of this violence that has happened and reimagining, you know, what could be and what should be, right, for Guyana and Guyanese women. And speaking of the contemporary artwork that is present in this book, I wanted to talk about how, because there's kind of this juxtaposition of a lot of these family photos that contributors have added or contributed to in the book. And a lot of these are from the past, but a lot of the artwork that's included that has been made by contributors is contemporary work as well. And so I wanted to know from you as a curator and also as the author and editor of the book too, why did you feel that including, you know, the contemporary artwork of these Guyanese artists was important? And how do you feel that it brings them and their stories into the present?
That's the core of my curatorial work. You know, you all, as you know from my classes, every other word is Guyana, Guyana, Guyana. I became a curator not because it was something I grew up, you know, I want to be a curator. I never heard the word curator in Guyana. I don't think I even would know what it was if someone asked me that. But I remember coming across, I think I was in undergrad. Yes. I remember coming across a collection of archival images on Guyana. And I was just blown away that this collection, it seemed to be such a robust collection, existed, that it was documenting this part of our history. And it was undergrad, I believe. When I came across it, I was majoring in English literature. Nothing to do with, you know, visual art. Later on, when I got to graduate school, I remember going to Dr. Deborah Willis, and I remember saying, Deb, here's this amazing collection. Do you know anybody that could do something with it, that can think about an exhibition or can write about it, a scholarship? And she looks at me and she goes, I'm looking at the person that should do something, you know, about it. And that was the beginning of me thinking seriously about the role of a curator in telling our histories and the importance of the role. And so my initiation into thinking at all about curating came from a place of absence, came from a place of, here's all this amazing stuff and we need people to do something about it. And, you know, thankfully you have incredible women in your lives that give you a good shake and tell you, yeah, we're looking at the person to do something about it. And so since then, it's been this journey for me, a professional commitment and a personal commitment to find whatever ways I can, whether it's in publishing or curating, to elevate the voices of contemporary Guyanese artists. And so to be able to do a project like this book, where we focus entirely on Guyanese women, who are even more under the radar. When we talk about Guyanese art, when we talk about contemporary Caribbean art, to be able to produce something that solely focuses on them and their work and uplift the work that they've been doing was an incredibly important thing to do. And to your question earlier, Jessica, it is the first of its kind. It is the first kind of a publication to bring together these women that are incredibly steeped in a beautiful, beautiful artistic practice. And they're not only engaging issues of migration, they're engaging issues of climate change within the Caribbean and social justice issues. So migration is just one of the things that they're engaging in their contemporary art practices.
Yeah, the book and all of the works as a whole speak really beautifully also to the class that Kimiyo and I took with you, curatorial activism, which was a complete game changer for me. So it's just wonderful to really cement these practices by observing how you do it and be out there looking at curating as its own form of activism.
Yeah, and I think that, your process and your methods, I think, definitely come through. Having been one of your students, I mean, it's like it's very clear. You describing it now, it just feels to me like I'm taking the class all over again, which is amazing. If anybody
What a good thing that you feel like you're in class together.
No, I love it.
We
Well, I
loved your class.
So, it's a wonderful thing for me. I'm having a great old time in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah, I want to be in Grace's class again. No, seriously, thank you for that. I'm going to show another image because we also wanted to talk about, and you actually started bringing this up yourself, Grace, but we did want to shift our focus to and talk about one of the really important actions that the text performs, and that is centering the stories of those who stay. Right, because we hear a lot about people who are leaving Guyana, and a lot of you also mentioned this, I think, in the story about the girl that you met in Ethiopia too. You hear about people, if you're looking in a certain area, people always want to leave, or they expect other people to leave a certain place just by how they have their own, impositions and thoughts, about a certain location. But we wanted to know a couple of different things. And what I was thinking in particular was in Natalie Hopkinson's A Return to Guyana, she writes this series of letters, and it's between her and her mother. And her mother's writing back too, and it's very beautiful. But in one of the letters that she writes to her mother, she talks about her uncle Ovid, and this is when they're in America. And her uncle Ovid tells her when they're discussing Guyana that he was just biding his time, in America until he could go back home. And so I wanted to know what do you think is the importance of showcasing Guyana as a place that both can and should be missed?
I love the way that's framed. All right, poet Kimmy, that's so beautifully framed. We start out this book writing about the act of migration as an act of reciprocity, that migration is a two-way street, that to leave a place, we have to reconcile with the truth that we're leaving others behind. I think one of the great erasures about talking about migration is that the narratives of people that are doing the leaving are the dominant narratives. And we need to do so much more work to elevate the stories and the experiences of the people that are left. And so a big chunk of this book is centered on the people that stay, whether they're staying by choice or whether they have no choice in the matter. And this chapter by the photographer who's based in Guyana, Khadija Ben, she does this incredible series of portraits of our Amerindian elders. And Amerindian in Guyana is our term for indigenous. So these beautiful portraits of our indigenous elders who have watched their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren in some cases leave, go off to the Americas, to Europe, or even neighboring Caribbean islands, Venezuela, and they stay. And so they become this incredible archive of what it means to see a country go through so much and then also see their own family members leave one by one. And the book really, Khadija Ben's work in the book is so poignant and so incredibly important because she gets to what your question is asking, Kimi, of how they are grappling with these two things, of finding value in the place they choose to stay when so many of their family members have left. And how do they reconcile and make peace with that? And that's an incredibly complicated thing to unpack and talk about. But I wish that when we talk about migration, that we continue to hold space for both of those things. The people that are doing the leaving, which I understand why that's the dominant narrative, but the folks that are left behind that stay are equally important to that narrative, are equally important to the migration story. And I think we need to do a better job, whether it's in scholarship or documentary or visual art or photography. We need to do a better job of centering their stories and centering their voices.
This, without this section, it would have been a completely different book. And I loved all of the stories. I especially loved a work by Dominique Hunter, a guide to surviving transplantation and other traumas. And Dominique positions the reader as the one receiving these narratives that are assuming that she's going to leave Guyana. And she writes it in the second person. So she removes the gap between the reader and herself and uses point of view as a device that basically leaves no room for otherizing. She doesn't ask the reader to consider what it's like being in her shoes. She puts them in her shoes. And I just love the hidden activism in that. She had really unmistakable agency. And it struck me that it must have been extremely important to you. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this, to have some of those who stay tell their own stories and show that they're not necessarily victims that were left behind all the time.
So many of the chapters and stories in this book were news stories, were just us in conversation with each other. You know, it was an existing work, an existing essay, an existing photography series. So much of it came from us gathering together. And I'm thinking back on Ellen and Deb gathering us in Florence for the Women in Migration book, and all of what, just to gather, and what that generates when we come together and share our experiences. And so much of the book came from just talking to each other. I remember Dominique sharing with me, I can't remember if it's over email or in an actual conversation, that, you know, you're indoctrinated from a very young age to leave. So what does that mean from a child's understanding, to be told that the place you're in is a place to leave, and that you should spend your days strategizing how to leave that place? What does that do to your psyche? What does that do to your sense of what your future looks like? And then when you begin to realize that you don't have the resources to leave, or perhaps you don't want to leave, then how does that make the situation even more challenging? And so I thought her story and her particular perspective, that being told from a child, you know, you were born in this place, but this is not a place to stay. This is a place to leave. What does that do to your sense of self? What does that do to your practice? What does that do to your vision for your future? And so it's so important to have that her perspective in the book.
Yeah, that was incredible. So another theme that Kimiyo and I want to cover, shifting from the ones who stay, very important theme in the book. We'd like to talk with you about the matriarchal webs that Guyanese women have been able to forge in spite of these patriarchies that they move between. Throughout each grouping of women's experiences in the book, there was a really strong reckoning with multicultural and geographically complex lines of descent. And the first section of the book, Mothering Lands, offers this really beautiful use of metaphor, the land as the mother and the mother as the land. And it helped us to understand the importance of matrilineal heritage in the Guyanese diaspora. There's a line in Mothering Lands where Erica de Freitas says, there's a matriarchal lineage that endures and rejects omission despite memories that may be pieced together with inaccuracies, elusive details, unintentional omissions. And we just wanted to hear you expand a little bit more about these matriarchal systems that really have been the kind of core of the diaspora in many ways.
I think all of us in the book, if I may speak for all 15 of us, but just from reading what each of us contributed, Guyana is a mothering land, if we can sort of personify a country as a mothering place, because it has nurtured us and it has shaped us and it has influenced us and it has impacted in incredible ways the ways in which we view the world. And so that was another theme that we all came together under is, you know, our mothers, our actual mothers have shaped and mentored and influenced our lives, but this land has also mothered us. This land has also nurtured us. And you don't just see that in the Mothering Land section of the book. I think you see that throughout all of the chapters. I didn't, curatorially or editorially, I didn't essentially purposefully, you know, plan it that way, but to see that that became, even with the contributors that are not in the Mothering Lands chapter, to see how they're always circling back to the importance of their mothers and to equating their mothers with a mothering land and a land that mothered them was an incredibly beautiful thing to see evolving organically throughout the book.
Thank you. It was beautiful.
It's actually really funny that you mentioned that too, Grace, because I felt like for me, this entire text changed my ideas on mothering. And it really expanded it, if anything, and just mothers and mothering, I think, together. And for me, you know, I felt that both anyone and anything can be a mother, because you do, as you've mentioned, see these instances of mothering that happen, whether that's, you know, you giving somebody a notebook, or Maria del Pilar's aunts, you know, coming and telling her about her Guyanese heritage, or the land mothering its people. And for me, you know, this really shifted the idea of mothering for me, because I still felt this idea of, you know, the mother brings something to term, right? But instead of this being a child or a baby, right? And I guess not all mothers bring things to terms, right? Because there's mothers who adopt too, but mothers who rear, right, another entity, another person. But it's not just like bringing somebody up, right? It's nurturing somebody's ideas, you know, their understanding of themselves, their understanding of their freedom, their creativity even. And I think for me also, to mother and the idea of mothering became this idea of loving in the deepest way possible, and loving kind of beyond the self, beyond the thing itself. And I thought that that was really beautiful. And Erica de Freitas notes, when she's discussing also mothers and daughters, she notes that each one before is a rehearsal for the next. And I thought that that was really beautiful, because what it said to me was that basically, you know, those who mother us, biological or otherwise, give us these gifts and strengths that are crafted across generations. And I think it is our duty as those who have been mothered to give those gifts back, you know, building on each generation and recreating or refortifying that world of love that they created for us. And to me, I felt that this book did that so perfectly. And I think that you gave back in that way. And so I just wanted to note that. And I'm grateful to have experienced it. So thank you.
Thank you. You know, so many of us in the book, we can't think of Guyana without thinking of our mothers. We can't think of our mothers without thinking of Guyana. The two are so connected and linked. And that's a question I'd love to see examined across all migration stories. One of the beautiful things about about talking about this book for the last few months is that we get emails from, Filipino Americans and Ethiopian Americans and Italian Americans who are reading the book and sharing how much commonality and connection they're finding in these stories about Guyana and about these relationships and about the ethos of this migration experience. And that is also one thing that they keep sharing too, is that they also can't think of, the Philippines without thinking about their Filipino mother, or Italy without thinking about their Italian grandmother. And so it's been a beautiful response to the book to see how us gathering and centering our migration stories about Guyana is finding inroads within Italian communities and Ethiopian communities and diasporic communities. It's been a really lovely response.
I love that. And also, I think even in your introduction, you had mentioned how some of the stories that were being told, a lot of people could relate to them, whether or not they were in Guyana. So I think to then have that kind of community response from all of these different communities only really proves everything that you've been talking about, which is so great.
So we had a couple questions that we saved just in case we had a little bit extra time. We could dive into those, or we could go ahead and see what questions we have in the chat. And we do have a few. What do you think, Kimiyo?
I'm fine with either. Let me see how many questions we have, because I already saw some early. Okay, we have a few questions. Maybe we can jump into those. I'd be down because they seem really great.
They are good.
Fellow alum Andrea is in the Q&A. Hi, Andrea.
Andrea's entered the chat. She has a great question too. She says, I'm struck by the age in which you left Guyana. 14 seems like your identity is shaped, but still so easily influenced. Did you ever struggle with assimilation or try to distance yourself from Guyana? If so, what brought you back?
Oh, my Lord gracious. Okay, wow. That's another book. This might sound very, very strange, but I think folks who are from the Caribbean might understand. So, Caribbean and Guyana is such a beautifully multicultural place. It's, Muslim and Hindu and Christian and Indian and Black and Chinese and Amerindians. And I am so thankful that that was my introduction to the world, is the way in which I grew up in Guyana and what I saw about what the world looks like. I thought the world looked like that. I thought the world looked like Indian and Black and Chinese and Indigenous, and that's the norm. And then I got to the United States, and I quickly, was shocked that that's not the norm. The transition for a lot of immigrants to this country, the transition was pretty rocky because my family migrated to the Washington, D.C. area, and the high school that I went to, first of all, to be a new immigrant in the United States, it's its own sort of precarious experience. To compound that with being introduced to American high school at 14 years old is its own kind of separate trauma. So those two things collided for me. And I remember my high school was deeply divided by race. And, the white kids hung out with the white kids, the Black kids hung out with the Black kids, and the Latino kids hung out with the Latino kids. And I did not fit in any of those silos. And so my introduction to American high school, and this particular high school, was largely an introduction to race in America and how that isolates you. And so, bless their hearts, My classmates never heard of Guyana. They didn't know what Guyana was. They said, but you're from Ghana, you don't look African, all kinds of myths and mythologies and misunderstandings. And to have that experience be your introduction to the United States, where up until that point you've been taught, well, this is the American dream that you're going to go pursue, was incredibly jarring and incredibly hurtful. And to Andrea's question, it took a lot to grapple with that. Up until that point, I didn't form my friendships based on race. I didn't form my most important relationships based on, who's what color and where you're from. And I felt incredibly stripped that I was being forced to now do that in this American high school. It took a lot of unlearning and a lot of pushing through my own understanding of race in America versus my understanding of race and where I was from, to move past something that was deeply hurtful and deeply traumatizing for me. And my brother also went to that same high school. And so we just had each other. We just had each other going through that and trying to figure out that experience of race in America based on a very, very segregated high school experience.
Just a quick follow-up question. Was in the introduction, you talk about the mythical American dream. Was that around the time that the mythology of it started to become clear to you?
I think the mythology of it is always becoming clearer to me. I think that is what it means to be an immigrant in these United States of America. I'm working on a project now, a curatorial project now that's looking at protest and mourning. And it's another example, protest and mourning in the context of what we saw in the last year and the violence against Black lives. And it's another example of the continuing jarring shock of what the American dream is, and a dismantling of that American dream. So to be an immigrant in this country means that you're continuously disrupting and redefining if it is a dream at all.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We have some other questions from Dr. Cheryl Antonio, who is here with us today. Hi. Let's see. So we have two questions. The first one for you, Grace, is how do you navigate global movement with the tensions between arrivals/departures, incorporating notions of East and West, or post-colonial and post-slavery?
I read about this in the Geography of Separation chapter, where especially, talking about living in India for that year, and how I showed up in India being embraced or being looked at as an American. Because I showed up with an American passport, with this Fulbright fellowship. And so instead of being seen as Guyanese, or instead of being seen as a woman of color, I was just largely an American. And all of the unwarranted privilege that came with. And Cheryl, I don't know how you feel about this. I know you travel a lot too, and your own Caribbean heritage, but it's a thing that I continuously struggle with. When you come from a place of such humble beginnings, your life has then taken you to incredible places of privilege. Then you show up in places like India and Ethiopia, and you have to grapple with an American kind of privilege. There are moments I think I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to, I don't know. I'm still struggling with it. It's a hard question, Cheryl. And I think every time, the moments we were able to get on planes and go somewhere, I think it's an acute, almost overly sensitive awareness that I have, that I come from where I come from, but I'm showing up in these places with an enormous amount of privilege surrounding me. And how do I stay honest and grounded and humble in that?
That's definitely important. Dr. Cheryl Antonio also has another question for you, Grace. And I think she wanted to know, where do you call home?
I still call Guyana home.
Oh, that's beautiful. That is so beautiful.
Where do you call home, Jessica and Kimmy?
Oh.
Hard question. I call home the place, Florida, where I grew up, and I have been in the US my whole life. But if I'm answering most honestly, we were asked this question at the very beginning of our program. Actually, it was one of our first prompts from one of our professors, and my true answer is my home. I feel is my body. But you know, I think that would probably make my parents angry, so I'll say Florida.
That's too funny. Yeah, I don't know, because I was born in Akron, Ohio, but I only lived there for 6 months of my life. And then I moved to Los Angeles with my mom. And then recently, in the past couple years, I've just moved around like quite a lot. But I'd probably have to say our tiny little Koreatown apartment is where I will always call home. As yeah, that's home. That's home to me. Very comfortable, very sweet, very loving time. Let's see. Okay, so
So we might have time for our backup questions.
yeah, which I'm excited for. I was just double checking.
Me too.
Yeah, so I don't know, Jess, do you want to go first with your questions, or I can answer?
Sure. My question is definitely it's about gathering, and it's definitely in the realm of as though Grace isn't busy enough. I have this question. But it underscored, the book underscored for me so clearly the deep healing power of gathering. And I was wondering if there are plans, or if you're considering ever gathering some of the artworks in the book for an in-person exhibition.
Oh my gosh. What a
Like you're not busy enough, I know.
what a dream. Well, you know, the book actually was, before the book, there were two exhibitions. There was an exhibition called Unfixed Homeland, an exhibition called Liminal Spaces. And it was a collection of contemporary Guyanese artists, not just women, but Guyanese artists as a whole, within Guyana and throughout the diaspora, engaging this issue of migration. So we have done contemporary art exhibitions, one at, the Caribbean Cultural Center here in New York. So we have engaged it, but we have yet to do one focused entirely on women. To gather again would be so lovely. And I've been thinking a lot about gathering. I've been thinking a lot about the power of gathering. You know, we were gathered for this book. We were gathered for the Women in Migrations book. I've been talking a lot to, I have a dear friend, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who her whole ethos, and she's a Cuban artist, but her whole, Jessica, who you're very familiar with.
Very fond of.
She comes from that default of how do we gather. She's a beautiful film out, in fact, now called When We Gather. And I've been learning a lot from women like her, women like Deb Willis, who really throughout their, you know, their scholarly practices, their artistic practices, have centered the importance of gathering and friendship. And we were able to do this on the page, not in person, but I dream about doing a kind of gathering like this in person when we're able to. But I think it's an incredibly, now that we've missed it for the last year, not that we ever took it for granted, but I think the fact that we couldn't gather for the last year I think when we're able to again, it will have completely new meaning and resonance as to why it's so important and critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking of friendship and going back to the amount of care that's in this book, you have done something that I think is so wonderful. And early on in the book, I think you list everyone's mothers, right? The names of everybody's mother who contributed to the text. And I thought that that was so beautiful. Um, and speaking of that too, you know, in a lot of the photos that are presented, we see everybody's names, right? Well, not everybody's, but almost everyone's names, you know, like Violet James, for example, whose image we showed. But also in your section, the geography of separation, you noted too that you actually changed the names of some of the people that were included in this section. And so I wanted to know for you, you know, what was the importance of naming, of including names in this text, but also what do you think is the importance of protecting the interests of those you're writing about and the people who are included in the work that you're making?
Such a good question. So we dedicate the book and we begin the book with a full page of names, as you said, and it's all of our mothers and their mothers. So the book is dedicated to our mothers and their mothers. So it's our mothers and our grandmothers. And it was done in the vein of say her name. We wanted to honor these women. We wanted to honor our mothers or grandmothers, many of which I shared earlier, you know, grandmothers where illiteracy was a normal experience in their lives. And so to have their names written and documented, and that is the first thing that you see when you open this book, was an important statement and an important act of reinscribing for us to make. That's also one of my favorite pages in that book, just visually to see the long list of our mother's names and our grandmother's names as who this book is for and who it's dedicated to. Almost everyone in the book was very open about, you know, who they were writing about and the real people's lives that they were writing about. And some of us made a different choice. Those of us that were writing more personal essays or memoirs, to not say their names. We had one particular contributor who started out the book not saying the names of the people she was writing about, but by the time we got to publication, those persons had passed on. And so they were a lot more free in being able to tell a story where they feel they wouldn't be compromising or offending or being hurtful to the person they were writing about. So it was a deeply personal decision. It was a decision about how we remember things versus how other people remember things. And it was a decision to be clear that we're speaking from our own personal experience. And so we're naming these situations and naming these names, but we're coming from that deeply personal experience. And we wanted to protect ourselves and the people that we're writing about and their privacy and their integrity.
For that, Grace. I think that we are getting close to the end, unfortunately, and I think the Zoom might close on us at 7:15. So Jess, I don't know if you had any other questions that you wanted to ask, or if Grace, you had any closing statements or anything you wanted to leave anybody with.
Yeah, I'd like to pass it over to Grace to kind of leave us with, well, first I'd like to say I want everyone and all of their mothers to read this book.
Yes, yes.
It's you know, you have the link there. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I hope everyone will take the time to read it and share it. And I would like, you know, Grace, if you have any final words and takeaways you'd like to share with us.
Well, thank you both for taking such good care of this project and for your incredible, beautiful, thoughtful, sensitive questions. The greatest joy as a teacher is to be able to be in conversation with your students. The greatest anxiety is to have your students turn the tables on you. So thank you for both of those things. And you know, my last thought is that I hope this book, it may be the first of its kind, but I hope that it's the first of many. And I hope that many of my friends and colleagues that are invested in this part of the world, both in the Caribbean and in Guyana, see the opportunity here to continue maybe volume 2, 3, 4, 5 of telling these stories, because the work is out there, the stories are out there, the art is out there, and it's just waiting to be gathered.
Waiting to be gathered. I love that. Yeah, and I hope to see future iterations of this, you know. I mean, it's much needed and such an important book. And I think, kind of to reiterate what Jess said, everybody please read this book. Please, I'm telling you, it will change your life.
It's life-changing. Yeah, okay. No, when Kimiyo and I met, we were like, this should literally be required reading, like in public schools, it should be. So yeah, thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you all, and I will say good night. Thank you, Jay at Skirball and Pato at APP and our entire team and staff, and Ellen Toscano. Thank you so much for making tonight happen. See you hopefully in real, Jessica and Kimmy.
Real life, IRL. All right, bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.